everybody, welcome to another episode of EdCast number 2. So this is Harris.
This is Misbah.
We have a very special guest again on our show. She's currently a head teacher in a primary school. She also is engaged with the British Army, a super high achiever, a highly productive person who we're going to ask lots of questions about teaching and some observations of hers about the tutoring industry as well. So come join us. Let's see.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm actually still a serving member of the Intelligence Corps. I'm a reserve officer. So yeah, I am still serving.
Excellent, actually. Wow, wonderful. So serving so many people together. Victoria, everybody would probably want to know your why behind whatever you've done and whatever you've achieved up till now. So what was this dire motivation, or what was this why behind all of the service that you've done first directly to the country through military, and then of course now with children, which are actually the backbone in the future. So, you know, if you can share your story with us, that'd be great.
Wow, the why. I mean, I think most people would have a kind of superficial why, and then perhaps a much deeper one that they perhaps don't even know themselves. And I think the superficial one for me is that I'd like to make a difference. I've always been socially aware, and I've always wanted to have a positive impact on people, on my community, on my friends, on my family. I've always worked really hard to doing that, whether that's as a child, putting a load of washing into the washing machine for my mum, or cooking for my family, small things that you could do as a child, really. And then latterly, as a grown-up, I've always been known as being a good listener, somebody who takes care of other people, a caring soul. So I think on the superficial level, it's about making a difference. But in recent years, for me, I've had the real privilege of having to take some time to consider and to reflect on what is an almost half century worth of life. And I think a much deeper reason for me is to do with my childhood, which is no secret. I've spoken about it a couple of times now, particularly in my TED talk, about when you come from a difficult background as a child, often you're left with some slightly invisible things that you then learn to deal with. And I think I grew up as a child perhaps not feeling good enough, through no fault of my mum's or my wider family, but I suppose just a situational thing that took place when I was a small child. And so I've always wrestled with myself really to try and do better, be better, achieve more, which has meant that I suppose some people might call me an overachiever. It's been said before, but I think now at almost 50, I look back at those achievements and I can look at them for the positives that they are, and also see where perhaps I've also hidden myself in them. For example, the qualifications I've done, there is quite a substantial list. But I think what that helped me to do was, when I was perhaps a bit socially awkward and felt a little bit anxious, I could just throw myself into books and hide in research and academia, which meant that I didn't really have to interact with other human beings. So I've learned better to do better now that I know better. And I think that that's the deeper level. So superficially, it's about making a difference to everybody. And on a much deeper level, it was about trying to fill a need in myself to be good enough, which I now kind of think I probably am good enough. I don't know whether that's the answer you were expecting.
No, actually, that's sort of quite elaborated answer, and and I know that you've given these talks where we've actually found out about your whole journey and all that, the ups and downs with leading. But one particular thing that stood out for us was leading with love, where I think that was one of the topics of your your TED talk, I think, as well, where I think it was language of love. Where it was really inspiring. So if you could sort of talk more about that angle and the concept behind it, and what led you, with the thought process of this is something which is missing in today's, the sort of journey that led you to this mantra.
So I've written a book, you're right, and the book is called Leading with Love, and it's about compassionate leadership. I think in our modern world, we perhaps confuse love with the kind of relationship love between couples or people who are in love. And for me, it's less about that and more about compassion and about loving humanity and doing things always with kindness and compassion. And that doesn't mean that I'm soft or a pushover. On the contrary, I think, at various times in the past, I have been called the Iron Lady, or, people will say that I'm a very firm but fair person. So leading with love and being compassionate does not mean that you allow high standards to slip or allow people perhaps to behave inappropriately. What it means is that, for me anyway, everything is about dealing with situations from a perspective of kindness and compassion. So whether that's an angry parent who's cross about something, or a child to child incident, perhaps they've had some kind of conflict, or even having to deal with a staff member who isn't quite meeting the standard that I would expect of professional people with whom I work. I think it's about the how of what you do. It's not the what you do, it's the how of what you do. So I never shout at people. I will listen first to try to understand, and I will try to unpick a little bit, like I just said about myself. I try to look a bit deeper from the superficial. If somebody's lost their temper and been cross, I try to understand why that might be. From a parent's perspective, it's often because they love their children so much and they want to protect them, and they are fiercely protective. Certainly with parents here, I've had conversations with them where I've gone straight to the heart of the matter, be that they are a young parent and they feel therefore quite inadequate. So being in the head teacher's office can be quite a challenge because of their own insecurities around that from childhood. So we open that up into a kind of a compassionate space, and I will say to them, is this because you feel anxious about being here? Is this to do with you a little bit, the way you're behaving now? And often they'll be honest with you and say, actually, I didn't have a great time at school, and I had my child when I was quite young, and I feel quite sensitive about this, and you're right, part of it could be that. And then we can get to the heart of the situation with their child. So I think for me, that's the same attitude that I have with my own children at home. I don't shout at them really. I try to understand and coach them through life. And it's that whole coaching attitude that I feel has helped me as a leader. And it's also helped me as a human being, a parent, and a sister and a daughter, and all of those things, a good friend that we would like to be in our lives. So the leading with love thing is basically just an extension of how I lead my life. But it has really worked for me. And I've been a head teacher now. This is my second school. Both schools have challenging circumstances, particularly this current one. And it's a system that has worked for me. It perhaps wouldn't work for everybody. I think it's my personality, it's my values and beliefs. And that's what comes through my kind of daily job, really. But I think in a school that was as broken as this school, it really helped to nurture people and to bring the school back to life. I call it loving it back to life. And I think that's exactly what I've done, which, as I say, doesn't mean that I'm a pushover or that we allow easy lives for people. It means that we do everything with children at the heart and each other at the heart. And it's very much a team effort.
With respect to this idea, has there been any inspiration or a situation or sort of role models that really inspired you to this kind of like your main driver when it comes to leadership?
I would say not one main person. In my book, I wrote about a man who was actually my first boss, my first head teacher boss, called Mr. Todd. And he had a very jovial way about him. Probably nowadays he would be considered quite old school and perhaps even at times inappropriate. But at that time, for me, he showed me that you could be quite open with people and get to the heart of things in a nice way, which meant that any barriers that they had there were often removed. But he was a very good role model to me. And before that, there were people who I admired and looked up to, but I wouldn't say necessarily that they were on an individual level. It's more sort of lots of people had small impacts on me that then collectively have influenced how I do things. What I would say is that I've had one or two quite fundamental people who've taught me how I do not want to lead anybody. So it's been, the positive people have been incrementally supportive and driven my leadership style, but the negative people have been quite stark because they've been so few, but they have really had such a terrible impact. So I think not shouting, being respectful, caring for people and caring for them because they're human beings and they should be cared for. I worked for somebody once who was not that way inclined and would openly embarrass and humiliate people, and I just felt that was just completely alien to how I operate in my personal life. So it's never something I would do in my work life. So yeah, I would say collectively the positive people all build this great picture, and I'm really privileged that I've come across so many lovely people, colleagues, family, friends. I've read some interesting books. I'm always open to new ideas and to challenge my thinking as well, which I think is really important, because I really do believe in that mantra: if we know better, we should do better. And I think we're always learning and always understanding new things about how we work. And the world of education, like the world in general, never stands still. So if we're all continuing to learn and new strategies and new resources and new technology come in, we are learning all the time about the benefits of those things, but also the drawbacks and how we can better prepare our children and ourselves to navigate that kind of tricky future world. And one of the things I would say is that I've become quite comfortable now, feeling uncomfortable, feeling like I don't know everything. As a new teacher, it was quite a nerve-wracking experience. I will now openly tell people that they will not know everything, and nor should they, that we should all be modeling that we're learning and embracing newness and finding the good in that newness, rather than just trying to pretend that we know everything and that we're good at everything. It's just a futile endeavor, I think.
So, coming back to, of course, your book and your why, and you talking about empathy a lot, and you also said, when we discussed before, and you just said the same thing, as well as a child and while growing up, you tend to hide yourself behind books and reading and research, which I can completely resonate to, and that makes a very introvert child who does not want to open up in front of people, who doesn't want people to know, usually what's going on, their weaknesses that at times the child thinks it's a weakness, may actually just be an opportunity, but at that time they don't want people to know what's happening with them. So how come this journey of being an introvert and then opening up to people and then standing in on a stage, talking to 1,000 people and telling them exactly what the story? So how did you cross that fear that you went through? Because it's very difficult to tell people this is who I am, and you just faced it and said it.
Well, so I'd like to say it was easy.
How did you cross that fear?
So several strategies. I'd like to say it was easy, but it wasn't. I was asked specifically to do the TED Talk for about 7 years, and I lacked the courage to do it completely. I was very nervous, and I think even now my daughter will watch that TED Talk. I have not yet watched it all the way through, and she will say to me, "Mum, your voice is really strange. You're kind of, your voice is kind of quivering." And she's right. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified to do that talk, and I rehearsed it several times in my office. I started off rehearsing it with people that I trusted. So my senior leadership team here at school, I said to them, look, I'm going to say these things about myself, and I think people might judge me for it. I think people might think, gosh, and she's in charge of teaching children, and it always felt like it was my shame that my dad had, ended his life, and it was a kind of embarrassing thing that I couldn't really share with people, and the story of what he did to us all and how he was and the influence that had on us was kind of an embarrassment in a way. And I suppose processing through the years and doing the research I've done has always been quite ethnographic. It's always been also kind of autobiographical as well. So I've looked at things like trauma in children and bereavement, and I've helped other children do that and manage that in various leadership roles I've had. So I've come to know myself a little bit, and I knew that perhaps I needed to get beyond this barrier in my head that it was a shame of mine. I was in my 40s, again, I started to come to this realization that there was nothing really more I could do. I'd done a doctorate, I'd done master's degrees, I'd done degrees, I'd run marathons. What else did I need to do to prove to myself that I was good enough? And so eventually I kind of agreed to do the talk, and I imposed that new target on myself and that new goal. And then I worked towards achieving that goal. And one of the things I had to do was break that down. And again, I talk about this in my book, how you break down those big, big, scary things. And step one was to talk about it with my colleagues here who I trusted. And their response to that meant a great deal to me. And then I rehearsed it on some student teachers here at school. We had about 30 student teachers, and I invited them one rainy day would they like to come and have a cup of tea and let me rehearse it upon them. And they all gave me extremely positive feedback as well. And then it came to the day of doing the actual talk, and I hadn't slept. And I arrived, it was a rainy day. I'd had a meeting in the morning. I tried to make an effort with my hair because my hair is always notoriously untidy, quite difficult to manage and a bit unruly. So I'd made an effort, and I thought, fake it until you make it, and tell yourself you can do it, and you've rehearsed this with many people, and all will be well. And then I suppose I probably had a bit of a moment of panic before the talk began. And the chap who was in charge of it, he gave me a hug beforehand, and he gave me something to hold in my hand. I didn't have any slides for the talk, so I didn't need the slide reader or the clicker button, but he said, just hold this, and if you get nervous, just squeeze it. Have something physical that you can just squeeze in your hand to take your mind away from this blind panic you're feeling. And once I'd gotten into the start of the talk, the first few moments, I think you can hear I'm nervous and I was extremely emotional. I kind of found my rhythm, and I got into the talk. And then I kind of held my breath, and the aftermath of it was just overwhelming, if I'm honest with you. People were contacting me on all my social media platforms. I had emails into my work. When it did finally reach the TEDx website and YouTube, people have obviously commented on that site. And those sorts of things kind of made me think, okay, I don't need to be ashamed anymore. That was 4 years ago now, 4 and a little bit. And since then, I'm asked to speak all over the place. And only recently, in fact, last weekend, I spoke at a leadership weekend for the Army. And for the first time in all of the talks I've done, and in the 4 years I've been doing this now, I found I only had minimal nerves, because I thought, these are just people, and I've done this before. And I was speaking about something unrelated. I was speaking about legacy, actually, unrelated to my talk, my TED talk. But what it showed me, and in fact, what I came away with, was that after 4 years, I'd finally found the courage to speak about things, because if people are asking me to speak, then they must want to know what I've got to say. I say similar things all the time because it's my philosophy of life, but I think that's a long-winded way of saying to you, it took a lot of effort. I am an introvert. People have called me an extroverted introvert. So when it counts with children or in work, I can be quite bubbly and quite out there, but then I do need to go home and just regroup, doing the garden or going for a walk with the dog, or just being quiet somewhere in nature, because I'm not a natural extrovert. It doesn't come naturally to me, which surprises people when they know that, because in my workplace, I can sound quite confident. So it's funny, isn't it, how we have these different parts of ourselves that different people see. If I'm comfortable with people, I can be quite relaxed and myself, but by and large, I'm quite an introverted person.
I think, if I could, I would give you a standing ovation right now. Bravo to crossing that fear. Bravo to standing in front of people, without thinking that what are they going to say about me? I think this is one thing that sets you free, which a lot of people, they spend their lives and still not able to set themselves free, thinking every time about what is the other person thinking about me. It's just so amazing and very inspiring. And in the end, of course, we would like you to give some message to specifically women out there, and of course, all leaders out there, how they need to set themselves free before they start leading. Because unless they do that, they will judge themselves and they will judge others. And that's what they will do. It will never be, they will never be able to fly, which is something that you always require. And of course, connecting to that, in your book, you're also talking about empathy and the use of the correct language. And of course, you're a head teacher, you've been a primary teacher, and of course, somebody with Army as well. So now, how does this leadership role differ in every way? So how does empathy with children differ from empathy with teachers who you're managing? And then, of course, is it different from the hardcore army perspective? So, yeah, how is the leader in all of these three circumstances different?
Well, if I'm really honest with you, I personally would say it isn't. The army has not been my main career, so therefore perhaps that makes it a bit different. The army is my reserve career, so it's something that isn't. So, for example, if I have empathy and I show humility and humanity to my colleagues in my current role, it won't affect my promotion prospects or anything like that. So perhaps other people who are regular service personnel might disagree. I don't think so, but they may have a different perspective to me, which is fine. So personally, I do not think there is any difference. I am the same with my own children, my two children who I love very dearly, as I am with the children at school, as I am with my colleagues. And the only way I know that my approach has got kind of any longevity is because people will contact me many years later to tell me that I had a positive impact on them. I had somebody contact me on Twitter a couple of years ago to say, I followed you for a couple of years now. Oh, it's not called Twitter anymore, it's called X. I followed you for a couple of years now, and you actually taught me in the year 2000. You were my English teacher. I think maybe she was in my year 8 English class, and she said, I was so inspired by you that I I still remember some of your lessons. And she actually quoted some of the things that we used to talk about in our English lesson 20 years before. And then another person contacted me and said, hi, miss, do you remember me? And of course I remembered him. And he said, this lady, the one before, she was now a head teacher in Carlisle. So this chap who contacted me said, I'm a deputy head in London. And, I can't believe it's you. And, you're doing all this wonderful stuff because you are our teacher and we loved you and you were just this lovely human. And I think being a good human should be at the heart of what everyone does. And I think that's perhaps what's a little bit broken about our world at the moment. So many people are focused on the wrong things. It's about money and capitalism. And I don't want this to get political, but I think if more people focused on humanity and human beings, then perhaps we might see things and do things a bit differently. I don't know. I say that from a privileged position. I work, I have a home, I have food to eat, and I can care for my children. So I know that I'm speaking about that from privilege, but that wasn't always the case for me. When I was a small child, we had next to no money. We didn't have a TV, we were hungry part of the time. And, that's just how our lives were. So now I do realize how privileged I am. But I think empathy and having compassion for other people should be just how we try to live. And that's certainly how I am in the army. I care for people. I care for my soldiers. I nursed and nurtured one of my soldiers who died recently. I wanted to make sure that he did not die on his own and that he felt supported. And I was just his chain of command, you'd call it, but that didn't mean that he didn't matter to me as a human being. And in the same way that I would do that for a colleague here, I've had teacher colleagues, I've given them places to stay if their lives have taken them down a path where they don't have a home for a little while. And I don't kind of share that publicly, I guess, but it's just a thing. I just think we can help people very simply just by actually doing that, helping them. And you don't have to really shout that from the rooftops for that to be a thing.
Cool. Victoria, another thing that I was interested to ask you was more from a technical point of view. So with respect to the current landscape in teaching and in our schools and the education sector in general, what's your take with respect to school leaders and given your leadership perspective and the mantra that you explained in this podcast as well? What would you say we're missing with respect to school leadership in today's climate where regulatory pressures are biggest ever with respect to safeguarding? Then you have the budget issues, which are increasing day by day. And then on top of that, with technology, you have threats from artificial intelligence, access to internet, which brings up safeguarding issues. So with respect to all the sort of changes that now exist in the education world compared to when climate we grew up in, what would you say from a leadership point of view, your perspectives are, and things that you say, you've learned and you would share?
I've just written the manuscript of my second book, actually. It's gone out to a couple of people who are influential educators. And the feedback I've had from that so far has been extremely positive. So I guess I can say this with some credibility because of that. I would say the way that the government in the last 40 years, and it's a little bit of a historical hangover, I would call it. So approximately 40 years ago, there was an experiment in education that said, in fact, there was a social experiment, full stop. It's called neoliberalism. And the impact of that on education is that everybody competes for everything. And it was meant to be beneficial. And in theory, it was a good idea, but it was never going to work in education because education is not a factory style endeavor. You can't have children who come in with an empty brain and pop in a certain amount of education and then they walk out having got their education and that's it. It doesn't work like that. Learning does not happen in that neat linear way. So therefore it becomes difficult to measure. However, the social experiment of neoliberalism decided that it was possible to measure this, very much so, from very small children all the way through, and that those measurements would be used to judge schools, not taking anything into account about changes in society. So in the last 40 years, there have been many changes in society, which all influence our children and our learners. However, the same rhetoric about competition, marketplace, accountability, testing, all of that, the inspection regime, all of that has, if not stayed the same, it has increased and it has become more and more a factor of daily life, whereas there is no recognition. I mean, even in recent years, the pandemic, the influence of the pandemic, it's as if it never happened. It very much did happen. It happened to children as old as my daughter. My daughter's 18. She's just done her A-levels. It was the first exam she'd ever sat because during GCSEs, there was COVID. So it just didn't happen. And the same with my son the year before. And I think there is this year, particularly, the government decided to change all the grade boundaries. So thereby punishing children who had been through that system. And I think, if all we are about in our country is judging and accountability, then we've lost sight of what is valuable about education as a system in its own right. I think weaponizing and politicizing education is the biggest mistake that has ever been allowed to perpetuate, because education shouldn't be a political tool. It should be apolitical. There shouldn't be anybody who's trying to score points or win votes based on what they do to education. It means very short-term views. Somebody's trying to make an impact in a year or two whilst they're in post as education secretary. That just means that we're all constantly spinning from one change, one initiative after the next. But with this overarching pressure of neoliberal instruments of accountability, Ofsted being one, things like SATs and testing children when they're in primary school being another. So I think the biggest threat to education has always been that and will continue to be that. And I think we see that nowadays with this very vocal movement towards making changes following the terrible death of the head teacher earlier this year. And I think if that doesn't speak volumes about the changes in society and the decline in people's positive mental health, there are so many mental health issues now in our society because of societal influences. None of them are taken into consideration for children. The system is broken in terms of supporting young people for their mental health issues. And they have to contend with so much more now than we had to. The worst thing I had to look out for was slipping on wet leaves or, getting a puncture in my bike as a small child when I was playing with my friends. Nowadays, you've got all the social media issues, all of the cyberbullying, all of the online problems to contend with as a small person, a young person, but with none of the skills and none of the support networks unless they come from school, because parents don't always provide those support systems. So from people's mental health all the way through to adult mental health. Parents haven't got the mental health strategies to support their children or to parent healthily, and schools don't have that for their staff or in order to be able to support those parents and those children. So in that kind of context, it becomes very challenging to meet the demands of those accountability measures without something, without the impact of that being felt on staff. So I think it's well documented and it's well spoken about, but mental health is key, which is why, again, I wrote about it in my book, the first book, and I've tried to give some simple strategies that I use, because this hasn't been an easy journey. But I think looking out for one another, and that's where the compassion comes through, and the empathy and the understanding and the support. So I think working together and having networks is crucial and key. But I think the big divide in that, the big barrier, if you like, to that happening has been, again, the political instrument and the political move towards free schools and academization. The minute that you create a divide between academies and state-maintained schools, you then completely remove the ability and the desire, really, for people to collaborate. There's no opportunity to collaborate with your multi-academy trust schools if you are state-maintained. Then there's very little appetite to collaborate with state-maintained schools if you're a multi-academy trust, because without money being involved, without exchange of cash, because schools have become small businesses. And that's terribly sad, because a long time ago, when I set out on this journey, which is a wonderful journey in education, there was a lot of collaboration. But I think that the move towards academization has changed that. That's not to say it won't come back. And I think that, again, the political drive towards forcing schools to academize, it might have abated for now, but it does keep cropping up periodically. I think once everybody is an academy, which is an inevitability now, then perhaps there will be, again, more opportunity to collaborate, because people will all be the same as they were once before. We were all once state maintained. And we will all end up being academies. So perhaps that appetite will return, I don't know. So I think for me, the key threats are the increasing accountability that takes no cognizance of societal pressures, the lack of opportunity and ability to collaborate and build networks without money being involved, and the financial pressures on a national level. Where our governments choose to invest money, I feel, is an enigma. Who knows?
And on this note, so we actually ourselves in our social enterprise try to contribute to the masses and the underprivileged sections of society through tutoring, tutoring. So we provide subsidized tutoring to the masses, and not just the ones who can afford it, which largely happens to belong in the dependent sector. With respect to tutoring, and a lot of our viewers belong to the tutoring industry, what's your take and your observation around the tutoring helping support with respect to children falling behind academically, as well as sort of mentoring needs, mental health wise, what's your take? What's your experience of working with the tutoring industry or the tutoring sector in general with respect to contributing towards what our education sector needs in the UK?
Sort of additional support, basically.
I think I do have some personal and also professional opinions on this. So my son, although very intelligent, is also extremely dyslexic. And so as a small child, when he was 7 and he was due to be tested in school, I realized that he would probably be tested and found wanting. And I did not want my son, who I could see was highly intelligent and very skilled at many things, to carry with him throughout his life this idea that he was stupid, which is what essentially he thought he was. My daughter, there's only a year between my children, not quite, and my daughter used to go for what she called sleepovers in his room. She would sleep in the top bunk and he would sleep in the bottom bunk, and she would be able to read his books upside down from the top bunk down, and he would be struggling over every single word, and so he felt stupid. And when I knew he was about to be tested when he was 7, I decided to speak to him about possibly going to do some additional work, not with me, because I think the parent-child relationship can become quite the challenge. I know a lot of parents struggle with things like homework. And, I'm an avid reader, as we know, and a keen academic. So it's quite painful for me that my son did not share that joy. But there is no point trying to force your children to do things that they are just not as passionate about as you are. So I arranged for him to attend some tutoring sessions. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say the name of the organization, but it's an international organization. And it was about overlearning certain strategies. So that overlearning idea really, I hoped would help him. And in fact, it did. And he met the required standard, let's say, to use the vernacular. He met the required standard when he was 7 in his Key Stage 1 SATs. But the subsequent 4 years until his Key Stage 2 SATs, of course, he had no hope of doing, because without that additional work, without that overlearning, really, he had no chance of meeting the standard. So consequently, he did not feel like he'd succeeded at school. And that really was painful to me. When he was 11, I then had him tested myself, because the school just thought he was a naughty child. Actually, he was extremely dyslexic, and the educational psychologist who assessed him said that his intellectual scores were extremely high, but his reading age and ability were extremely low. He'd never seen a clearer case of dyslexia, which just spoke to what I already knew, really. And my son said to me, "At least now, Mum, they will know I'm not stupid." And actually, I didn't mind them thinking that I was stupid. I would rather them think that than think I was naughty. And I just think, what a complicated world. My own son with me, emotionally intelligent and academic on the inside of the circle. I couldn't change any of that in his head, and I couldn't change any of his experience. And he went to what Ofsted would call an outstanding school. So that's my personal experience of tutoring. As a professional, I wonder where the two things meet. And I think I put my son through tutoring to help him to overcome the hurdles that are put in place by our government. I do not think it's right to test children who are 7 or 11 for that matter. However, that's what we do. So I think for many parents, they want the same thing that I wanted for my own child. And I think tutoring has got to fulfill that need, and there is a place for it for that reason. I think children should be equipped for life. So I think tutoring has got its place. And I think if we are talking about supporting students to fill gaps, and I think particularly for children who are unwell, we have had some children who've had some significant illness and long periods of absence, and the tutoring has really supported them in terms of bringing them back on board. It's one-to-one, it's quite intensive, but the child feels that their needs are being absolutely met in a way that perhaps they wouldn't be met in a class of 30 or 35 students. So I think definitely there is room for that. And older children as well. Again, when my son was due to sit his GCSEs, although it never happened because of COVID, he had a maths tutor and a literacy tutor, an English tutor, to help guide him through the vagaries of the examination system, without which I don't think he would have passed his maths and English. On the upside, he got an A+ in engineering, an A+ in PE, and an A+ in design technology, all of which he's extremely competent at and doing now as a job. But he never would have passed his maths and his English as they are currently configured had he not had a tutor before that. So he's had tutoring, my son, as a small child, and also latterly when doing his GCSEs. And I would say there is room for that to happen in our world. But the only unfortunate thing about that is, by and large, you have to be quite wealthy to pay for it.
I think we captured most of your response with respect to tutoring, and I know you couldn't see us, but it was captured in different as well. I think with what you said about tutoring, one additional thing before we sort of wrap this up, and I know we're conscious of the duration of the podcast as well, is with respect to your recommendations. So with the government introducing the national tutoring program, where they're saying that schools can have subsidized tutoring, for example, with respect not only to pandemic learning loss, but also general mentoring, which is school-led, for example. And I know there is just 1 year left of this national tutoring program. Whether through your personal experience in your own school or the wider teaching community, what would be sort of the recommendation or suggestions to the DSE that you might have Did it work? Is that something that the government should continue to be involved in, whether financially or regulatory-wise?
I think that, again, in terms of the marketplace, I think there's a lot of cronyism that goes on at the Department of Education and with the government. And I think what happens is the rhetoric of the day, the idea of the day is often taken up by educational professionals, and they become then the preferred option for the government to kind of invest money in. So I think it's wrong of the government to dictate to schools and to school leaders who they should use for their tutoring services. I think that is totally wrong. We have built up super relationships with some exceptional teachers and support staff here that we have paid to do our tutoring and to do our support work, both in and around the school day and, you know, as additional support for our children. They don't fall into the category all the time of the companies that the government want us to use. So actually that's money going to waste, and also they don't fund it fully. Again, I don't know what they use our tax for, but it's certainly not where it should be invested, which is in actual children. So I think, what would I say to the DFE? Ring fence the money for tutoring by all means, but don't ring fence the companies that you have to use that money with. It's an insult to school leaders who are very adept at what they do, and it prevents an open way and transparent way of recruiting tutors, rather than just doing it from a cronyistic position.
So, just to wrap it up, give one advice to head teachers and leaders around you. What would that be?
Be brave and have moral courage, and always place your children that you are responsible for at the heart of your decision making. That's it. And the wider
if you talk about the wider teaching community, so the teachers in general, I know you're more very early in the leadership role, but with respect to teachers who on a daily basis are interacting in classes and groups and behavioral issues, detentions, and still fighting towards better pay, as well as workloads, etc. What would, if you were to sort of go back to a teaching career and the things that you've learned, what would you say to the wider teaching community, which in the last few months have had probably more strikes in recent memory that I can remember? What would your advice to them would be in terms of how to navigate these rough waters? Teaching, the first thing I would say is that working with young people is probably the most important job that anybody can do. It is the most important job that will change our society for the good. And that is not just empty rhetoric. If we can invest in our young people and give them the skills that they need for life, then we will not have half of the issues that we have post-school for children in society, be that unemployment, criminalization, lack of literacy, poor numeracy knowledge, poor ability to manage their finances, whatever that is. I think if we can invest in them, the smaller they are, the more we invest in them when they're small, the better our society will be. So anybody who is considering working with children, be that as a tutor, as a teaching assistant, or even as a teacher, they are committing to a worthy life of impact on young people, and potentially far beyond their school years. As I said earlier, people contact me now many years later to say I've had an impact, and I think every single one of us would remember somebody from our school days who invested in us and who talked to us about the skills that we had, the potential that we could reach and fulfill. And I think you could be that person for a child or the next generation coming through. And it is such a profoundly important job that if you can get beyond the workload and find strategies, and there are strategies out there, and there are head teachers like me out there who try and minimize that nonsense. But if you can find strategies to overcome the workload and sometimes the isolation, if you can build a network and work smarter, not necessarily harder, then you will have the most fulfilling career of any career that anybody could ever have. Honestly, that is truly what I believe. And I think that is why I endeavor to make my workplace for my staff here as positive and rewarding as it possibly can be, because we all have those days where there are difficult children, difficult parents, difficult governmental decisions to navigate.
but you need someone who's an advocate for you as a teacher. You can see that in any school that you go into. And I think if that school does not have the person at the top who is an advocate for the staff as well as the children, then perhaps that isn't the school for you to work in. We are out here. There are still some people who don't subscribe to that kind of thinking, but we are out here. Come and find us and work for us, because we will nurture you and make sure that you then have that impact on those younger people that is needed.
I think that's a very interesting note to sort of end this, and you're right. I think it's just the right person has to be in the right profession, and this is the most sort of impactful, fulfilling, if that's the aspect you want to keep in the profession. Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Victoria Carr.
So much.
It was very lovely to have you. We'll put your we would love to put your TED Talk links and your journals and the books that you have published, that you are about to release, in our description as well. Let's stay in touch. It was amazing to hear you, and I think we'll probably see each other in the many shows that are coming up in the country.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.